The air inside the New York Metropolitan Bank was thick with impatience. The rhythmic tapping of fingers against countertops, the low hum of murmured complaints, the occasional sharp sigh, all signs of a long, exhausting wait. The line of customers snaked through the lobby, each face a portrait of quiet frustration. No one wanted to be here. Among them stood Helen Carter. 72 years old, her small frame wrapped in a neatly pressed coat that had seen better days. Her frail fingers clutched an envelope, its corners softened from being held too tightly, too often. Inside was a collection of documents she barely understood, but one number she knew for certain, $350. Gone. Taken from her account without warning. She had double-checked, triple-checked. She wasn't mistaken. This wasn't just money. It was groceries, electricity, the difference between a warm apartment and a cold one. And now, she was here, waiting in line, praying for someone to listen. But Helen knew the moment she stepped forward that no one would. Next, a voice snapped. The teller barely looked up. Emma Walker. Young, polished, exuding the kind of disinterest that comes with too many hours behind a counter. She continued typing, her manicured nails clacking against the keyboard. Helen swallowed, steadying herself. Good afternoon, dear. I need help with my account. It seems there's been a mistake. Emma exhaled, finally glancing up. The look in her eyes wasn't one of concern. It was boredom. Name? Helen Carter. Emma's fingers danced across the keyboard. The screen flickered, reflecting cold blue light into her indifferent eyes. She frowned slightly, then let out a dry, almost amused chuckle. Ma'am, these are standard fees. There's no mistake. Helen's chest tightened. But, I never had these charges before. I don't understand. Could you, please, just check again? Emma rolled her eyes. I just did. Helen's hands trembled as she slid the envelope forward. I brought everything I have. Statements, letters. Emma pushed it back without looking. None of that matters. The system is correct. A heat rose in Helen's cheeks. She felt it creeping up, the mix of frustration and humiliation. Around her, people shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. But she knew they did. She could feel the weight of their silent judgment. She was wasting their time. She was just another old woman who didn't understand technology. Her throat tightened. I can't afford this. Emma smirked, crossing her arms. Then maybe you should keep more money in your account. The words hit like a slap. Helen's vision blurred, her breath unsteady. And that's when he spoke. Why are you talking to her like that? A voice, calm, firm, laced with quiet authority, cut through the room like a blade. The lobby fell dead silent. Emma's fingers froze over her keyboard. Customers turned their heads. Even the bank manager, Ryan Cooper, who had been idly watching from a distance, stood up straighter. From the back of the line, a man stepped forward. His hands rested casually in his jacket pockets, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Helen turned, startled. The man took another step, tilting his head slightly. And then he took off his cap. The room gasped. Because now, everyone knew exactly who he was. Emma blinked, her smirk faltering as recognition flickered in her eyes. Ryan Cooper, the bank manager, stiffened, his jaw tightening as he took in the man standing before them. Keanu Reeves. Silence pressed against the walls. A hush so thick that even the faint hum of computers and the distant beeping of the ATM machines seemed to fade into nothing. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked onto him, customers shifting, whispers rippling through the crowd. Some lifted their phones, angling for a discreet photo, but no one dared to break the moment. Keanu's gaze never left Emma. His expression was calm, but there was something unreadable in the way his dark eyes held hers, as if peeling back every layer of her indifference. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice low, steady. "Why are you talking to her like that?" Emma swallowed, fingers curling around the edge of her counter. She shot a quick glance at Ryan, looking for backup, but the manager's face was a mask of irritation. He didn't like the attention. Not like this. Ryan stepped forward, straightening his tie, adopting the forced smile of a man used to smooth-talking his way out of problems. "Mr. Reeves, I assure you, there's no issue here," he said, his tone slick with practiced charm. "This customer is simply misunderstanding our policies." Helen let out a quiet gasp, but Keanu didn't look away from Ryan. His expression didn't change, but somehow, the air in the room felt heavier, charged with an unspoken challenge. "A misunderstanding," Keanu repeated, his voice even. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, then turned back to Helen. "Ma'am, what exactly is the problem?" Helen hesitated. She had spent so much time being dismissed, ignored, belittled. But something about the way Keanu asked, genuine, patient, made her throat tighten. She took a breath, forcing her voice to steady. "They took $350 from my account," she said. "I don't know why. I don't know how. And they won't tell me anything." Keanu's eyes flicked back to Emma. "Is that true?" Emma shifted, suddenly finding her keyboard very interesting. "Sir, as I said, the system." Keanu raised a hand, stopping her. His tone never wavered, but there was an authority in it that made her mouth snap shut. He turned to Ryan instead. "Check." Ryan let out a strained chuckle, glancing around as if expecting someone to back him up. The other employees had gone still. Even the security guard near the door seemed reluctant to get involved. "Sir," Ryan said, his voice dipping into condescension, "as much as I respect you, we have protocols in place. We can't just change things because someone." "Check," Keanu repeated, softer this time, but somehow more final. The room held its breath. Ryan's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers twitched at his sides before he turned to Emma. "Pull up the account," he snapped. Emma fumbled with the keyboard, typing in Helen's information with jerky movements. The screen loaded. Numbers, transactions, fees. She squinted, scrolling, her face paling just slightly. Ryan leaned over her shoulder, eyes scanning the screen. His expression darkened. Keanu caught it instantly. "What is it?" Ryan hesitated. It appears there was a fee applied." Keanu took a step closer. "For what?" Emma's fingers hovered uselessly over the keyboard. Ryan inhaled sharply through his nose, forcing another smile, but there was a flicker of unease beneath it now. "A maintenance fee," he said. "Standard policy." Keanu tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Really?" "Because I've seen a lot of maintenance fees before, and they don't usually triple overnight." Emma flinched. Ryan exhaled sharply. "Sir, I understand your concern, but these policies are in place for a reason. If the customer kept a higher balance." Keanu's jaw tightened. "So you're saying she's being penalized for not being rich enough?" Ryan bristled. "That's not what I said. But it's what you meant." The room was dead silent. Helen stood frozen, her hands gripping her coat as if holding herself together. Around her, the other customers were no longer just bystanders, they were invested now, watching, waiting. Keanu turned to the monitor, scanning the screen himself. His eyes flicked over the numbers, absorbing the details. Then, with a slow inhale, he said, "Open another elderly account. See if the same fee was applied." Emma's throat bobbed. "Sir, I don't think." "Do it." Her hands trembled slightly as she typed. Another account loaded. The same $350 deduction. Keanu's voice dropped lower. Another. Emma obeyed. Same fee. A heavy silence settled over the room. Keanu let out a slow breath, stepping back. He glanced at Helen, his jaw tightening. It's not a mistake, he murmured. Then, louder, to the entire bank, it's a pattern. Ryan's face twisted. Mr. Reeves, I don't know what you think you're doing, but... Keanu turned fully to him. What I'm doing, he said, is exposing what looks an awful lot like fraud. Ryan paled. Emma swallowed audibly. And across the bank, one of the customers quietly lifted their phone, hitting record. Ryan's face twitched, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. His eyes darted to Emma, then to the other employees, searching for support, for control, but the room wasn't his anymore. He knew it. The customers knew it. And, most importantly, Keanu knew it. Keanu exhaled slowly, hands still tucked in his jacket pockets, his stance deceptively relaxed. But there was nothing relaxed about the way his gaze locked onto Ryan's, steady, unflinching. You've been doing this for a while, haven't you? He asked, his voice even, but carrying the weight of something dangerous. Targeting elderly customers. Quietly skimming money from their accounts, assuming they wouldn't notice, or that even if they did, they wouldn't have the means to fight back. Ryan forced a chuckle, but it came out thin. Mr. Reeves, I really think you're jumping to conclusions. There's no conspiracy here. Keanu's lips twitched, just barely. Then you won't mind if we keep looking. Emma flinched, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. Ryan clenched his jaw, turning on her. Enough. That's company information, not public record. A voice cut through the tension, small but firm. Actually, I think we should keep looking. The room turned. David Brooks. He stood just a few feet away, hands clenched at his sides. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, his ID badge hanging loose around his neck. He looked nervous, sweating even, but his gaze was locked on Ryan's, defiant in a way that was entirely unfamiliar. Ryan's face darkened. David, he said, his voice sharp with warning. David swallowed but didn't look away. His voice wavered, but he didn't stop. Sir. I've seen these charges before. More than once. I thought it was just a system error, but now, he turned to Keanu, hesitation flickering across his face before he took a breath and forced himself to say it. I think he's right. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ryan's jaw tightened, a vein pulsing at his temple. You think? Ryan spat. You work for this bank, David. You understand what's at stake here. Keanu's eyes flicked between them, reading the silent war playing out beneath the surface. Ryan was losing control. And he knew it. I understand what's at stake, David said, voice shaking. That's why we have to stop it. Keanu nodded slightly, approval flashing in his gaze before he turned back to Ryan. There it is, he said. The first crack in the dam. Ryan's hands curled into fists. This is ridiculous. No crime has been committed. No one here has any authority to investigate. Keanu pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. A crisp, mechanical beep echoed through the room as he lifted it, camera lens catching Ryan's furious expression. You were saying? Keanu asked. Ryan inhaled sharply through his nose. Turn that off. No. Ryan's fingers twitched. I'll have you escorted out. Keanu smiled, slow and deliberate. You can try. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd. Someone behind them muttered, he really doesn't know who he's messing with. Ryan's face turned red. Here's what's going to happen, Keanu continued, lowering his phone slightly but keeping it recording. You're going to pull up every elderly customer's account who's been hit with these fees. You're going to refund them. All of them. Right now. Ryan let out a sharp breath. You can't tell me how to do my job. Keanu tilted his head, considering. You're right. But you know who can. He turned slightly, nodding toward a man near the back, an older gentleman, suit pressed, phone pressed to his ear. Ryan's breath hitched. The regional bank director. The older man lowered his phone, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped forward. I just spoke with legal, he said. We'll be conducting an immediate audit. Ryan's mouth opened, then closed. Keanu's smirk was barely there. See? I didn't have to tell you anything. Ryan looked like he was going to explode. His fingers flexed, his eyes darting around for an escape. Emma had gone completely silent, pale and motionless. David, on the other hand, looked lighter. The regional director turned to Helen, his expression softening. Mrs. Carter, I'm so sorry for the trouble this has caused. Your account will be corrected immediately. Helen blinked, disbelief washing over her. You mean? I get my money back? Every cent. Her lip trembled. Thank you. Keanu finally tucked his phone back into his pocket, his work here done. He turned to Helen, offering her a small, knowing smile. It's not charity, he told her. It's what's right. Helen let out a shaky breath, nodding. The regional director gestured toward security. Escort Mr. Cooper out. Ryan's face drained of color. Wait, But there was nothing left to say. The guards moved in, firm hands gripping his arms, steering him toward the exit. Emma looked frozen in place, her breathing shallow. Keanu turned, catching David's gaze. You did the right thing. David exhaled. I hope so. You did, Keanu said. Then he lifted his chin toward the rest of the room. And now everyone knows it. A pause. Then, applause. It started slow, hesitant, but grew into something undeniable. Customers clapping. Employees watching, wide-eyed. Keanu gave Helen a final nod before turning toward the exit, pushing open the heavy glass door. The cold New York air hit his face as he stepped outside, the noise of the city rushing back in. Behind him, inside the bank, things would never be the same again. The cold air outside the bank bit at Keanu's face as he stepped onto the bustling New York sidewalk. The sharp contrast between the chaos inside and the everyday indifference of the city felt almost surreal. People rushed past, cars honked, life continued as if nothing monumental had just happened. But inside the bank, everything had changed. Helen still stood at the counter, gripping her coat, her frail hands trembling, not with fear, but with something else. Relief. Vindication. The feeling of being seen. She turned slowly, taking in the way the room had shifted. Employees who had once ignored her now stared, uneasy, uncertain. Customers who had once averted their eyes now looked at her with respect. She had been just another old woman to them. Not anymore. The regional director cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Mrs. Carter, please, let's make this right. His voice was softer now, carrying none of the cold detachment she had endured earlier. He nodded toward the teller, a different one this time, an older woman with kind eyes. Let's reverse those charges immediately. Helen hesitated, glancing toward the entrance where Keanu had just walked out. A small part of her wanted to run after him, to say something, thank you, maybe, or just. I'll never forget this. But she knew, somehow, that wasn't his way. Instead, she turned back to the teller, let out a long breath, and nodded. The process didn't take long. Within minutes, Helen's account was restored, every penny accounted for, along with an official apology from the bank. It should have felt like a victory, but Helen knew it was bigger than that. This wasn't just about her. She straightened, finding her voice. And the others? The regional director blinked. Excuse me. Helen pressed the envelope to her chest, standing taller than she had in years. You owe me an apology. But you also owe one to every single person you've done this to. Are you going to make this right for all of them? The director hesitated. A moment too long. Helen's voice hardened. Because if you don't, I will. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People were still watching. Recording. The weight of their eyes pressed against the director's back like a physical force. He exhaled through his nose, then nodded slowly. We'll launch a full investigation, he said. Anyone affected will be reimbursed in full. Helen nodded once, satisfied. A small, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She had spent a lifetime being dismissed. But today, they listened. Outside, Keanu pulled his jacket tighter against the wind, his breath misting in the crisp afternoon air. He had no destination in mind, just the quiet satisfaction that came with knowing something had been set right. His steps were slow, unhurried, as if he were letting the moment settle before moving on. Then, just as he reached the corner, a voice called out behind him. Mr. Reeves. He stopped. Turned. David Brooks jogged up to him, slightly out of breath, his tie loosened, his face still carrying the tension of everything that had just unfolded. But there was something else there too, determination. Keanu raised an eyebrow. You good? David nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. I wanted to say thanks. Keanu gave a small, knowing smile. For what? David let out a short laugh. For pushing me to do the right thing. I've known something was wrong for a while, but I kept telling myself it wasn't my problem. His expression grew serious. That changes today. Keanu studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. David hesitated, shifting on his feet. So, what now? You gonna tell the whole world what happened in there? Keanu's lips quirked. The whole world already knows. David glanced over his shoulder. Inside the bank, customers were still talking, employees still shaken. And outside? Dozens of people had their phones out, scrolling, recording, sharing. The moment was already out of his hands. David let out a slow breath. Guess it doesn't take much to start a fire. Keanu chuckled. Just a spark. David grinned, then took a step back, offering a nod. Take care, Mr. Reeves. Keanu returned the nod. You too, David. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the hum of the city, just another face in the crowd. But in the bank, in the city, in the world, things had already begun to change. 3 days later, the world knew. The video had spread like wildfire. It started as a ripple, one clip, then another, shared from phone to phone, jumping across platforms at breakneck speed. The headlines followed soon after. Keanu Reeves exposes bank scandal targeting the elderly. Hollywood star confronts corrupt bank manager, justice served. Hero or just a decent human? Keanu Reeves steps in where others wouldn't. News outlets picked it up. Talk shows dissected it. Comment sections exploded with praise, outrage, demands for accountability. People started checking their own bank statements. Some found similar fees. Others came forward, sharing their own stories of being pushed aside, ignored, dismissed. And just like that, something that had been swept under the rug for years was suddenly center stage. Helen Carter sat in her tiny apartment, watching it all unfold on the screen of an old television. She had never been the kind of person who paid attention to the internet, but now. Her face was everywhere. That moment, her standing at the counter, Keanu beside her, Ryan's face crumbling as the truth unraveled, was being replayed again and again. She still didn't know how to feel about it. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She moved carefully, still feeling the weight of the last few days in her bones. When she opened the door, she wasn't surprised to see him. Keanu stood there, hands in his pockets, the familiar warmth in his eyes. He nodded once. "Mrs. Carter." Helen let out a small laugh. "I think we can drop the formalities at this point, don't you?" Keanu smirked. "Fair enough." She stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. He hesitated for just a second, then entered, glancing around at the small but well-kept space. It was modest. A lifetime of memories tucked into corners, books stacked neatly on a worn coffee table, old photos lining the walls. A home built not on wealth, but on love. Helen shuffled to the kitchen. "Tea? Coffee?" Keanu shook his head. "I won't stay long. Just wanted to check in." She gave him a knowing look, pouring herself a cup anyway. "You've been watching the news?" Keanu leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Yeah." Helen stirred her tea, thoughtful. "It's strange," she admitted. "I spent my whole life just trying to get by. Never thought I'd be the center of a story like this." Keanu exhaled. "You shouldn't have had to be." She looked up at him then, her gaze sharp despite her age. "And yet, here we are." He didn't argue. He just watched as she took a slow sip of her tea, the weight of years sitting between them. After a moment, Helen set the cup down. "You knew what would happen, didn't you? The second you stepped in." Keanu tilted his head. "Maybe." Helen smiled, small but genuine. "Not the first time you've done something like this, is it?" He chuckled. "No." She let out a soft laugh. "Well, I suppose the world needs more people like you." Keanu shook his head, his voice quieter when he spoke. "The world needs more people like you." Helen studied him for a long moment, then nodded, as if accepting that truth. She glanced at the television, still playing footage from the bank. "So what happens now?" Keanu straightened. "The bank is under investigation. The refunds are being processed. Ryan Cooper won't be working in finance again anytime soon." Helen let out a breath. "Good." Keanu's eyes softened. "And you?" She smiled, but there was something different about it now. Stronger. "I think I'll be just fine." Keanu nodded. That was all he needed to hear. He turned to leave, but just as he reached the door, Helen's voice stopped him. "Keanu?" He looked back. She held his gaze, her eyes steady. "Thank you." His smile was small but certain. "Anytime." And with that, he was gone. Helen watched him disappear down the hallway, his footsteps fading, leaving behind nothing but the lingering echo of what had happened. Of what he had done. She turned back to the television, watching as the news played on. The world was still talking, still demanding justice, still learning what had been hidden in plain sight for so long. And for the first time in a long time, Helen Carter didn't feel invisible. She felt heard.